Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. If you love the podcast, please subscribe and rate us wherever you're watching. Today, I am really lucky to have Eric Berger. Eric was my second guest on the podcast many months ago. He's also the senior space editor at Ars Technica and the author of the new book, Liftoff, chronicling the origin story of SpaceX. So Eric, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Terry, it's great to see you again.
A little bit of an unexpected last minute podcast because there's been some things happening in space. What's going on with the Russians? What happened with this test?
Yeah, so very early on Monday morning, it would have been Sunday night here in the United States, the Russians launched a Noodle surface-to-air missile from the northern part of the country and struck an old satellite. It was launched in 1982. That was about 480 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. Basically, I guess, wanting to demonstrate that they still have the ability to shoot down satellites in space. The problem is that this satellite has an orbit that intersects that of the International Space Station. Now, the International Space Station is at a lower altitude. But we've really first learned about this as we were waking up here in the United States on Monday morning, and the space station crew had been told to basically shelter in place inside the Crew Dragon and Soyuz spacecraft attached to the space station. And they were there for about 2 hours, and that was in case there was some kind of a debris impact that they could escape and come back to Earth. And you know, this was not a pre-planned maneuver. And so this was a new debris situation. And then a couple hours later, it became pretty clear that the debris had been caused. It was resulting from this anti-satellite test. And then the question was, why the heck are the Russians shooting down a satellite that is going to affect the International Space Station? Because they have two cosmonauts on board. They just launched a big module, Nauka. And have invested, 2 decades in maintaining and building and upkeeping the space station. By Monday afternoon, NASA had condemned it. Bill Nelson, the administrator, was very strong. U.S. State Department condemned it as reckless. And then this morning, we woke up and saw that the Russians had come out with a statement saying, "There's nothing to see here." It was just it was a response to U.S. provocations, basically in space. The space station was never at risk, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. And that's really where we are now.
So there's so many things to unpack. You're talking Monday. This would be Monday, November 15th, which our time was yesterday, but just in case someone's watching this weeks in advance in the future. And they launched from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's different than Baikonur. So I launched from Baikonur. Yuri Gagarin, all the humans are in Kazakhstan, but this is more of a secret military launch facility, I guess, in the north of Russia.
Yeah, it's several hundred kilometers north of Moscow. Certainly, I've never been there. I don't think much media has. They do a lot of their military launches from there.
Right, and this is a military attack. This on a Russian on their own, not against someone else, but this was definitely a military operation. This was not
right.
Communication satellite or something like that. Yeah.
And so countries have done this before. The United States and Russia both previously demonstrated the ability to shoot down satellites. It's basically signaling a capability to the world that, look, you mess with our satellites, we can mess with yours. China did it in 2007, and India did a similar test, a couple of years ago.
2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, the question here is, though, why did Russia feel like they needed to show this again? And why did they shoot down something at a pretty congested orbit, just below 500 kilometers in low Earth orbit, relatively close to the space station, lots of other valuable assets? And they really picked a provocative target, and it's very concerning from someone who worries about space situational awareness, debris. I mean, this is thousands more pieces of debris that now are going to have to be tracked and maneuvered around. And this comes at a time when SpaceX is putting up Starlink satellites, OneWeb is putting up its satellites, and other constellations are coming along. This just really, really creates a big mess in low Earth orbit.
So the intention is what really matters, and what are the intent? That's what intelligence always wants to know, what the intent behind it. But before we get there, I just had a guy named Hira Virde. He has a PhD in space debris. We talked about space debris about a month ago on the podcast. So if you want a deep dive about space debris, lesson in orbital mechanics, listen to that. But the big picture on what happens, and if you saw the movie Gravity, You can see this. But Eric, I've been talking about that. You and I have talked about this. I really think space debris is the biggest threat to humanity, at the risk of sounding dramatic, that nobody's talking about, because that debris is going to be there forever. And when you blow up a satellite, as you can imagine, it makes 1,000 other, well, in this case, 1,500, apparently, according to the news reports. I don't have any. I don't have any. I'm not talking to Space Force. I have no insight. All I know is what I read in the Washington Post and on Ars Technica by Eric Berger. So you have this cloud of debris, right? You blow up a satellite, there's all these pieces. Talk about what happens to those pieces of debris.
Right. So, the satellite's traveling through space. It's falling around the planet at, 20,000, more than 20,000 kilometers per hour. And so it gets struck by a missile. And so you have this huge kinetic impact, and it literally blows the satellite into smithereens. And so some of the debris kind of keeps on going in the direction it was. Others sort of get blown up, blown down. I mean, you can imagine an explosion in space, stuff goes everywhere. And so
what does that mean when it goes up and down? Yeah.
Oh, and in terms of altitude.
Not in the same orbit. Yeah.
Right.
And so, right. So what's
some
the
debris gets blown higher, some gets lower. I think that was the concern about the International Space Station. And sort of intersecting with this on future orbits. I think on Monday morning when they did that maneuver, they just had so much uncertainty. They were really just sort of sheltering in place while they figured out sort of what the true risk going forward is. And I think it's going to take some time to figure that out.
But that debris.
But you're right. It is
forever. It's maybe not forever.
It's not there forever. So it depends on how high the satellite is. Like when the Chinese did their satellite test in 2007, there's lots of condemnation because it was at above 900 kilometers. So that debris will be there for decades, kind of slowly coming back, because even though you're above the Earth's atmosphere, even out to 1,000 kilometers, still a tiny bit of drag. So over time, unless you have independent propulsion, stuff comes back. I mean, as you know, the International Space Station, which is at about 400 kilometers, periodically has to raise its orbit due to that very slight drag. So this debris probably will be there for 5 to 10 years. The problem is if it collides with something else, it creates more debris, and you sort of get this chain reaction. It's just a huge mess. It's a nightmare for everyone who has to work in space, and it's really kind of a wake-up call to the problem, as you talked about, debris. If you want to build satellite constellations, if you want to have Earth observation satellites in low Earth orbit, I mean, this is where you're going to put a lot of them. And so you're just really making that area more congested, and at some point you will reach a limit, and there will be too much debris, too many satellites, and it becomes kind of an unsustainable environment. No one is quite sure where that tipping point is, but it's out there.
Well, you talk about the Chinese in 2007 at 900 kilometers. Well, fast forward to 2015, Terry Virts was on the space station, and I had to maneuver the ISS when I was commander to avoid that debris, and I was down at 400 kilometers. Yeah, and we probably have to maneuver every year to avoid that debris that the Chinese created. And that, my point is, it was a very different altitude. And you're talking 5 to 10 years, but I've heard other experts, and it depends on the altitude. But I mean, the debris can be there for decades or even centuries. Once you get up, well, Hubble's been there at 300 kilometers for 30 years without any, it hasn't been reboosting its altitude. So I think some of this,
I think it's 450, and the shuttle missions, I think, did reboost.
Or 300 miles. Yeah, I'm sorry, 300 miles.
Yeah. So it's a little bit higher than the space station, so it's subject to less drag. And I think it did get boosted by the shuttle missions when they went there. But it's been a while.
2009. It's been over a decade. Yeah.
Now I'm not a physicist, so I could be wrong about this, but maybe because it's a little more massive than a smaller piece of debris, it's less subject to atmospheric drag. But yeah, I mean, eventually that will come back too.
The ballistic coefficient, but not for a while. My point is, it's
right. No, it's this debris will be there, and its impacts will be with us for a long, long time.
And there are other things in orbit up there. So real quick, we're going to talk about the Russians, but also I know you've written a lot about Elon Musk and SpaceX. Your new book is about that. And in Liftoff, I don't know if you talked about the Starlink constellation, but Elon is putting up tens of thousands of satellites. Not only Elon, Blue Origin, his competitor billionaire, wants to do the same thing. Airbus wants to do the same thing. I think Boeing's involved. I can't keep track of all
Telesat
these
in Canada, Russia, China,
Right.
Europe.
China's going to do it too.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And there's no regulation of this. I like it. If you want to fly a 777 from New York to Paris or Moscow, there's like international standards and organizations that regulate air travel, but there's nothing like that for space travel. So these guys are just putting up tens of thousands of satellites, and they're not all gonna, like, at the end of their life, they're not all gonna come back to Earth controlled. A lot of them are gonna just die and become debris and create drag. So we're making, my point is, we're putting up debris, potentially a massive cloud of debris once they start running into each other. That'll be there for centuries. I mean, in the year 2300, in the year 2500, there's going to be some guy on a podcast talking about, why did those guys back in 2000 make all this debris up here? This is a problem that is long term, and it's unregulated.
It's the regulation that exists is very limited. So to launch your satellite constellation in the United States, the process you have to go through is the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, permitting.
Right.
And basically their job, you're asking them for access to the US market. So you have to get their permission, and then you can launch your satellites. But they are a permissive regulator. They're looking for reasons to approve these constellations for the good of commerce, and not looking at it from orbital debris. And so there's been this food fight in Congress and the White House over the last several years about, should Department of Commerce, should NASA, should DOT, who should regulate FAA, should be FAA, who should regulate sort of the question of space situational awareness, orbital debris, and make sense. And unfortunately, there's just been no sort of clear guidance from the US government about that. And it's kind of the rest of the world takes their lead. It seems to me that if there was one area of space where we would like to see a global approach to this, it would be these mega constellations and sort of making sure we keep low Earth orbit in a sustainable environment. Because obviously the US is not going to permit Chinese launches or European launches.
It has to be international, right?
It has to be international.
Yeah.
And because you're absolutely right, space is the common good. And that's what's so disconcerting about this missile test. It was just a absolutely flagrant disregard for that environment at an orbit that's both going to be up there quite a while, and also where you have all of these valuable assets. And that's really concerning,
It's beyond concerning. So in 2015, I'm the station commander. I used Russian rockets and fuel to maneuver the station to avoid what the Chinese did, which was the same thing as what the Russians just did. They clearly know that this is a problem. And the Russians I love the Russians, by the way. My crewmate, Anton Shkaplerov, was up there. The highlight of my mission was hanging out with him in space. They're, as people, they're wonderful. But when you look at the government, I don't think that Mr. Putin, he doesn't do anything that's not planned. He's the master chess player, and he's thinking 3, 5, 10 moves out into the future, right? So this is not an accident. This was not a military general that said, let's try this out without getting approval, right? This was deliberate. And so
absolutely deliberate. I mean, they hit the target that they were going at, and they knew exactly what the orbit was. So yes, it was absolutely deliberate.
They knew what the consequences would be. They knew that their own cosmonauts would be a danger. They knew that it would outrage their partners on the International Space Station, and they knew that this debris would be there for a long time. So is this a precursor to a Ukraine invasion? Is this a way to threaten us to take out our satellites? Is this, that's the question, right? What are these 5 moves in the future? What are those moves that they were looking at?
So first of all, I don't think anyone knows. And if people know, they're not talking. The Russian explanation was that this was a routine anti-satellite test. Basically they see
they happen all the time. They happen all the time.
They see the U.S. Space Force, and they sort of want to make sure that the world knows that they're prepared for those aggressions in space. I think we can set that aside. Probably the darkest way that I have to look for it, but sort of the most compelling explanation to me, is that Putin has looked at the sagging fortunes of the Russian space industry. They don't have a commercial space industry like the United States is, and their national SpaceX, their national industry is falling rapidly behind China. So if you extrapolate that out 10 or 15 years in the future, you have the United States flourishing in space flight with mega constellations going to the moon, and Russia's not going to be involved in that. So you have lots of economic activity in low Earth orbit. And China had just launched the Tiangong space station. They're going to build that up over the next few years. They have plans for their own mega constellation. So its two most important rivals from both economic and strategic standpoint are going to have a dominant position in low Earth orbit in 10 or 15 years, certainly surpassing the Russians. And so one way to ensure that they don't get the upper hand there is just to render it far less usable than it is, to just sort of take out certain orbits. And so if they do 3 or 4 more of these anti-satellite tests like that, then you start to get the point where you do render some of these orbits really unusable, just because you're constantly having to dodge debris. So that, I think, my own personal opinion, and I could be 100% wrong, is that Putin understands this and has basically sent a message to the United States and China that if you can destroy a thing, you can control a thing. And so he's basically saying, we are players in low Earth orbit. We can pee in the pool at any time and make it so you don't want to swim there.
Caddyshack.
So I don't think he has many other options, because I've written a lot about the sagging fortunes of the Russian space industry, and they're still living on 1960s technology.
What America's did in 2007, our response to the Chinese, was to blow up a satellite in space. But it was 100 miles up. It was very low. And within a few weeks, all that debris got re-entered into Earth orbit. So we were able to go, hey, look, China, we can do this too if we want to. But we did it on a satellite that was almost re-entered, and it didn't matter. So if that was Putin's goal, was just to show the world that we're strong, the timing doesn't make any sense, whatever. And if he could have just done it on a lower satellite.
There was more to it than just that.
There was more to it than just that. And I think your analysis, unfortunately, may be right on. There's also, I think one of the biggest threats right now is the possibility of China invading Taiwan. They've been sending all their airplanes at Taiwan. It's been awful for those who haven't followed it. And, there's been similar indicators in Ukraine. So I don't know if it's a precursor to that, or if Putin is just starting if this is gasping straw at space access. I don't know. But that's,
one hopeful thing
is an understatement.
One potentially hopeful thing I take from this is that, there are lots of reasons for China and the United States to be at loggerheads right now. The Uyghurs, confrontation over Taiwan, there are lots of concerns about their human rights abuses, and so forth. But we definitely have a common goal in having a sustainable environment in low Earth orbit and beyond. And so much like you saw the United States and Soviet Union come together in the 1970s and 80s around space exploration, you might find sort of a bridge between the United States and China now in sort of establishing norms for responsible behavior in low Earth orbit. So that may be something that eventually comes out of this that would be positive. But where Russia would fit into all that, they're bordering on becoming a rogue state in some senses with this test.
That debris affects the Chinese station, Tiangong, like you said, as much as it affects ISS. And, the climate, Chinese carbon from a coal plant affects us all to a certain extent, but like orbital debris affects everybody the same. It really is. It's an egalitarian threat. It's the same threat everywhere. So I think that the question of intent is really, and I don't know, that's something that I can't say, but I'm putting myself in the crew's seat. What's it like to be on the ISS when your own partner blows up, has this aggressive military? It's kind of like, I was thinking of it. It's like you're landing in New York or Moscow or Tokyo, wherever, and the military just decides to start being AAA in the air, not at you, but like nearby, like you wouldn't necessarily want that to happen. It's probably not going to hit you, but it's not a great thing. And you talked about sheltering in place, and so what we do when you're on the ISS, and we call it a conjunction. There's a piece of debris that's going to come close. You go down in your capsule, you shut the hatch, and the theory is if it hits the main part of the station and there's a big air leak, at least you're safe and you can, undock and come back to Earth. Of course, you're assuming that that debris doesn't hit you in the capsule. There's a chance that might, it's only 5% or whatever, but there's a chance it could hit you in the capsule, which anyway, it's just not a good situation. And I can't.
Do you put your pressure suits on, or do you take them with you, or how does that work?
You take them with you. I think it depends on the level of severity. If they're like, this thing is going to hit the ISS for sure, you'd probably put them on. But I think normally you just go down there and close the hatch, and because if it hit and there was a big depressurization, there wouldn't be an emergency. You wouldn't have to undock right away. Like you would have time, but at least you're safe in a pressurized situation. So, but still, everybody's kind of like looking at each other, and they're friends and they're colleagues, and they're not focused on politics at all. When I was there, they took Crimea. There was a Ukraine civil war. All this terrible stuff was going on, and we were very good friends. We still are to this day. The Russians I was there with. And so I'm sure the crew, I haven't talked to them. I don't know what they're doing, but I can certainly imagine that the crew is getting along well, but this is still like,
my guess would be that the Russian civil side of the space operations in the country didn't know this was happening. Like,
for sure. I think if they knew it happened, they probably found out from the flight director in Houston. There's a big red phone on the flight directors conference, like literally it's like the bat phone, and you pick it up and you talk to it used to be Air Force, it's probably Space Force now, the guys tracking debris, and so it rings and, hey, there's a debris coming in 8 hours and whatever. So that, I'm guessing that's how a lot of the Russians found out. I'm sure they don't share, this is a secret, highly secret thing. And it clearly, again, they're thinking 5 steps out on the chessboard, that this is not at their concern, which is anyway, it's a fascinating subject. That's also terrible in many ways, just like not what you wanted to have happen. Well, I mean, I don't know what else we can say about that. It is what it is. I think it's going to be an interesting time in the coming months and years to see what happens.
It raises important questions. I think there's considering the International Space Station, there's a couple of things. It's aging infrastructure, right? It's been up there. Some of the core modules have been up there since 1998. And it's another sign of sort of, it's been a really bad year for US-Russia relationships in space. The Nauka module, they docked it to the space station and kind of did that in a reckless, dangerous way to some extent, not nearly so much like this test. And then a few months ago, basically speaking anonymously, the head of Roscosmos told the Russian news service that a female NASA astronaut was to blame for a hole in a Soyuz spacecraft.
Right.
There's been some really ugly incidents this year. And so it's, you've got, so I think this sort of brings to forward the question of the future of the space station, because on one hand, the hardware is getting a little long in the tooth. And then you've got these fraying relationships between the US and Russia in space. And that's sort of the foundation of the ISS partnership is US and Russia, with then Europe, China, Japan, Europe, Canada, and Japan, kind of coming on board. So, NASA's been thinking a lot about this. And so this, I think, probably will just further accelerate the need for, commercial space stations, in low Earth orbit as a replacement for the ISS.
Yeah, but if there's a cloud of debris, you can't have them. That's really the point of what just happened.
It may be like, that they alter the orbits based upon that, go a little lower or go a little bit higher. The future of the ISS was already a complex story, and this just makes it more, adds to that complexity.
It is a fascinating subject for maybe Eric Berger's next book. the future of the partnership we have with Russia. And that honestly, it makes me profoundly sad because I love training with them. I love spending time with them. Um, this was George H.W. Bush's idea. Dan Quayle back in 1991 kind of started this partnership in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. And it's been one of our most successful foreign policy initiatives since World War II. But man, if frayed is putting it lightly, interfering in our elections,
Yeah.
reporters dying and eating bad poison, and doctors falling off buildings. There's been a lot of things to fray this relationship for sure. So I hope we can bring it back, but I don't know.
They were rock solid certainly when the space shuttle retired.
Yeah.
And I think that may have been because they enjoyed the money, and they also liked the fact that they had the power in the relationship, right? They controlled access to the space station. And so a lot of this instability has come up since SpaceX started flying the Crew Dragon spacecraft to the space station. And NASA was like, we'll still put our people on your vehicles if you want to put a Russian on a Crew Dragon, but we've got our own way to space, and it can take 4, not 3, and it's autonomous, and it's reliable. And all of a sudden, NASA's not paying them $500 million a year or the like for crew transportation, and NASA can control its own access. And so a lot of this sort of recent instability, I think, comes back to the threat from SpaceX primarily to kind of their position in space.
Well, not only astronaut transportation is one thing that's relatively small. It's the whole global launch industry has been upended, and the Russians are not the beneficiary of that, right? I mean, they used to be the low cost launch provider of choice a decade ago, and that's not true anymore. And the Chinese have their own coming out, and
you look at the Proton rocket, which is kind of a competitor to the Falcon 9 full thrust. And that has gone from 6 to 10 launches a year to basically 1 launch a year because all of its commercial missions have gone away.
One of those blew up. We were having lunch one day, getting ready for launch, and the Proton blew up. I'll never forget that. They blow up every once in a while. Of course, SpaceX does too, but you mentioned the Nauka. So it's this big module that the Russians launched. And when it docked with the ISS, I don't know exactly what happened, but some thrusters got stuck on, and it basically was spinning this 1 million pound spaceship out of control. So that was not good. When I was there, again, all this stuff happened in 2015. They'd sent up a software test, and it was supposed to be like test mode, not active mode, but they forgot to send that signal, and our Soyuz started firing. And Samantha came down, was like, "Terry, what's this red light on the Soyuz?" And I was like, I immediately looked to see if we were out of control yet or not, because I knew the rocket had been stuck on. So it's not anything new. What do you think about the ISS cracking? Speaking of problems on the ISS, the Russian segment has had some metal cracks, and that's the over decades of plus or minus 250 degrees, that metal is going to crack eventually. What do you know about that? What do you think about that?
Well, I think the cracks are a serious issue.
What are they? Where are they? Yeah.
They're on the Russian Zarya module, I believe. And it's just basically hairline cracks in the metal structure of the space station. It's not causing a leak or anything like that, but cracks propagate. And so there's some concern over time that they'll become worse, maybe wider. When I talk to people at NASA, they don't seem too concerned about the structure of the space station. There seems to be a pretty quiet confidence that can go to 2030, if not longer. But I don't know, man. It's something worth watching. And it's the Russians talk about the cracks, and it's hard to me to say whether that they're really concerned about the cracks, or maybe they're looking for some concessions from NASA to remain in the partnership. I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. There are these cracks there that and cracks, they grow slowly, they kind of take their time, and then sometimes they just suddenly they grow faster suddenly. Elon Musk would call that a rapid disassembly or something. He has
rapid unscheduled disassembly of RUD.
Exactly.
I don't think we'll see a RUD in space, but certainly getting dinged by micrometeoroids can't help with that, and also sort of the torsional strain of the Nauka module firing its thrusters while attached to the space station. I don't think
That
that helps.
that took some amount of life off of the ISS, just that one incident. I don't know how much, but I'm just a pilot. I'm not a material scientist. So what do you think is, so there's the ISS. I think we'll fly it as long as we can. I'm hopeful that it lasts for a while longer. I don't know how much longer that's going to be. I think it's in everybody's interest. I think normally you look at things like, what is your interest? What's your self-interest? And all the partners' self-interest is to keep it going. It keeps everybody's space station program gainfully employed. It gives us a chance to do research. I'm working with a company that's doing space manufacturing, and things that we learn just by these science experiments we do on the ISS are helping legitimate American companies, so that, there is some good that's come out of the ISS from a technical thing. But beyond that, like we had talked about before we got started, what the future of commercial in LEO. Bigelow's out of business, right?
Yes, Bigelow's out of business. So
what else is there?
Yeah, the space station is going to exist, I think, as long as nothing else is there, because you need a destination to go, right? I think we're done with the spatial era where the vehicle would just kind of go up and orbit around and do science and other things like that. I think it's, we're now to a point where we need some place for these capsules to go, and whether it's low Earth orbit or beyond, into deep space. So NASA's plan has been to try to foster the development of commercial space stations, to get private companies to invest in the construction of these facilities, and then, agreeing to purchase a time, basically to rent them for their own astronauts, and to pay for transportation to and from. And so for a long time, the leader in that was Axiom Space. They're based in Houston. They raised a couple $100 million in private money. It's led by Mike Suffredini, who's the former International Space Station Program Manager. But then
he was my boss.
Yeah, and then a couple of weeks ago that we've had some announcements. Another Houston-based company called NanoRacks partnered with Lockheed Martin to build what it called Starlab, which would be a space station. Private space station.
Yeah.
And then Blue Origin partnered with Redwire and Boeing and Sierra Space to develop what it called the Orbital Reef, which would be a rather large space station in low Earth orbit. Blue Origin is Jeff Bezos's company.
Right.
And then there are other bidders as well. NASA has a contract out basically for advanced design studies. And we should find out the winners of that, I think, early next year.
So these would be government subsidized LEO space stations?
No, but the government would sort of help pay for some design work, and then in the second phase would actually buy services.
Well, so subsidized, not funded,
they're not right. They're not
subsidized.
Theoretically, the government would not pay for the development of the station,
right?
But they would commit to buying, like, we will buy $1 billion worth of services in 2028 or 2029.
That's important.
If you build it, basically, if you build it, we will come, which will give private investors confidence. And then the idea would be that the private company would sell time on the station to NASA astronauts, but also to private astronauts, or to the UAE space agency, or Australia, or whoever, and or tourists. And so it basically, it's like commercial cargo, commercial crew, commercial LEO destinations, basically.
So in the past, that was basically Bigelow, who had the inflatable module. There's one on the ISS, but they went out of business. But now there's Axiom, and Axiom's actually going to build modules on the ISS.
Yes, they're going to build up to 4 modules, and
hopefully detached.
Right. The plan for them is to build up a space station attached to the ISS, and then in 2028 or later detach and be a free-flying space station. These other proposals would be free flyers as well. And there's probably several unannounced companies, like Northrop Grumman almost certainly is bidding on this contract with some kind of modified Cygnus spacecraft. And then SpaceX presumably is bidding as well as some other companies.
What you mean, bidding to work with Axiom, or for the
bidding
other
to have
NASA?
Their own space station?
Right.
Like you could see Starship modified to being some kind of low Earth orbit destination.
Wow. Okay. So you've got Axiom, you've got Blue Origin partnered with Lockheed, you said?
Blue Origin, Sierra Space are leading that.
Okay.
And then you've got NanoRacks
and Lockheed.
Partner.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I wish them well. The thing about the ISS is it's a great place for science, but it's not a good place for commercial activity. It's not a good place for manufacturing. You're not going to
Yeah.
set up a factory there. That's just not what it's designed for. But these other companies could do things like that.
Well, that's right. The idea would be you would learn some lessons from the ISS and build these facilities for less, with more sort of purposes intended. And I think, you probably know better than a lot of people that the it's a damn difficult thing to do, to build something and operate it in low Earth orbit, from a maintenance standpoint, and it's expensive. And so I'll be impressed if we get to the point where there are commercial space stations, simply because I think it's such a massive undertaking.
Right.
So I'm rooting for all of these companies to succeed, and hoping
Yeah.
that maybe one or two actually do.
No, it's exciting. The good thing for Axiom is that they have an existing ISS. I mean,
Yes.
so they can kind of build it on that same paradigm. I think they're using the same contractors that built some of the ISS modules, right? They're just
They
building
use
more.
Thales, yeah.
Thales
And
Alenia from Italy. Yeah.
yes. And the benefit for them is they're going to be able to tie into space station power and other things like that. So they won't have to launch a fully self-sufficient module from the outset.
Right. No, that's exciting. That's interesting. I didn't realize these other companies were doing it. Okay, so I want to tie lots of things. You're going to be impressed with this. So you're the Space City weather guy,
Yep.
and you're like Houston's most trusted guy whenever there's hurricanes and stuff. Seriously, you're amazing. We've been having all this climate talk at COP26 and so on. And one of the things that came out of that, I just read today in an email, there's a group of folks. It's not China, Russia, whatever, but it's something to start to put together a framework to avoid orbital debris. I don't know if you saw that. Did you see? I think it's like 12. It was 12 companies that agreed. They're basically saying when we put stuff up, we'll make sure we have a way to bring them down and control them. I don't know if you saw that.
I saw a headline about that.
But
I haven't read it
yeah.
in depth, but I
Yeah.
have a pretty good idea of who the players are.
Yeah. I read through. I knew a few. I didn't know the other ones, but it was interesting that came out of COP26, where they're talking about climate, because in some way, orbital debris really is like a climate problem because it affects us all. It could be there for centuries and stuff. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting thing. And as I was thinking about you're always talking about hurricanes. So it was just interesting that this whole environmental problem, space to be problem, and they announced it on the day that Russia did this insane, irresponsible test.
Yes, it was an insane, irresponsible test. I mean, you think, your podcast is called Down to Earth, and it's everything that happens in space does affect us here on Earth.
Talk about that, Eric. What would we lose if we lose, theoretically, if we get into a shooting war in space over whatever? What would I don't know if you can see this in my, I got an iPhone in my hand. What kind of things, what would the average person who doesn't really care about space lose?
So a lot of the functions right now in space are done out of geostationary space. So that's a lot higher. That's about 46,000 kilometers maybe above the surface of the Earth. And so if you had a low Earth orbit situation, those kinds of activities will not be disrupted right away, but you might get a standpoint where it really wouldn't be safe to find launch windows through the cloud of orbital debris in low Earth orbit. So maybe it's more difficult to maintain those facilities. But the reality is that, there's expected to be a lot of economic activity in low Earth orbit over the next 20 years. Most notably through these mega constellations to provide low latency broadband, internet around the world at any location. But there's also all of this activity in Earth observation. I mean, if you think about weather satellites and things like that, some of that is at geo, but some of that is in low Earth orbit. So you would see a degradation in weather modeling of hurricanes and other weather phenomena. You would lose a lot of your capacity to look at the planet on a daily basis. And potentially the shooting war could spread to geostationary space. There are lots of satellites up there, and frankly, there's a limited amount of space because geo is a special regime of space where the satellites are basically falling around the planet at the same velocity at which Earth is rotating. So the satellites can look down at the planet, the whole time, and so it's a pretty thin band, and again fairly congested. So it's basically cutting off our future. If you make a mess of low Earth orbit, not to mention, the Hubble, the International Space Station, the Chinese space station, and lots of other things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this was a good discussion. Tell me about your book.
Oh, Liftoff. It's about the origin of SpaceX. It just goes back to the beginning of the company, because the SpaceX was founded, by Elon Musk in 2002. But at the time, there had been lots of other entrepreneurs who'd come into space and said, well, we're going to be like the FedEx of space, lower the cost of getting stuff to space and so forth. And they'd all failed. And so I wanted to go back and understand why SpaceX had succeeded. And now today, they're basically the most dominant space company in the world. And it seems like it was, preordained or destined to happen. But, those first 6 or 7 years were really, really hairy. They almost went under several times. Their first 3 launches failed. And so it's really the story of Elon and the people who worked for him and all of the things they went through to make SpaceX a success.
Interesting. Are they gonna keep on being a success, or is Elon gonna have a Twitter meltdown?
Elon, I think, uses Twitter to vent steam. That's he has different personalities, but it's difficult for me to see, barring some kind of catastrophe, like a human accident with a Crew Dragon vehicle would be a real setback for them and for commercial space, because that would really bring out the naysayers, I think. But barring that, they are on a trajectory right now where they're so far ahead of the other transportation companies in space and can kind of continuing to accelerate because they're not resting on their accomplishments, that it's just hard to see, as I say, barring some kind of catastrophe, it's hard to see anyone catching up to them anytime soon.
Put that into context. So you got Elon Musk and you got Jeff Bezos, probably the 2 richest men on Earth, or they're on the Mount Rushmore.
The 2 richest people, for sure.
Yeah. So, and they both have a space company, and they both started them a long time ago. And compare and contrast, where SpaceX is with where Blue Origin is. Blue Origin has giant buildings, by the way. I think they have the biggest building in the world down at the Kennedy Space Center. But give us a rundown.
They're the king of infrastructure, but they are, one way to put it, I would think it'd be like, SpaceX is Amazon and Blue Origin is pets.com, which went defunct, in the .com bust. It's not even really comparable, because Blue Origin has not ever built an orbital rocket, probably 2 or 3 years away from doing so. And that rocket is already, facing challenges. Will not measure up to Starship in any way. And so it's just, for a long time, for most of the last decade, SpaceX has had probably a factor of 5 times as many employees as Blue Origin. So it's been able to do much more. But the fact of the matter is, Elon is also more deeply invested, not with money, but in time and sort of effort to push SpaceX forward.
Bezos retired from Amazon. Now he's full-time at Blue.
Well, full-time means 2 afternoons a week, maybe. Okay. That's what full-time means. Bezos is still doing Amazon stuff. But he's also enjoying, as you might expect of someone who's in their late 50s, and is, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. He's enjoying that life, I think it's safe to say. Whereas Elon is much more involved in the day-to-day activities of Tesla and SpaceX. Very, intensely so. It's probably the most simplistic way to look at it is, Jeff Bezos is, bought a $500 million yacht for him and, Lauren Sanchez, his girlfriend, who he left his wife for. And Elon, who's also had his personal relationships, of course, but is living in a $50,000 house in South Texas to be close to the Starship project, because he wants to be there to make sure that moves forward. So he's more dedicated to his vision, I think, than Jeff is. Jeff Bezos has a great vision, but it's far less believable because we're not seeing that kind of progress that we do with SpaceX.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the Blue Origin hasn't launched even a test mission into orbit. And a decade ago, Elon was already sending cargo to the ISS. I was the robotics branch chief. We were practicing the first robotic captures of these things. So it's amazing how much far you laid it out one time, and I was kind of shocked at how much far in ahead SpaceX is. It's amazing.
SpaceX is ahead, and the thing that's impressive, Terry, is that they're continuing to pull away. It's not like the gap is closing.
Accelerating. Right.
They're opening the gap further.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, we'll see what happens, but China, they have quote unquote commercial companies that are state-owned enterprises. They're definitely going to be trying to undercut the launch market, and that's going to be a tough competitor, because when the Chinese government decides to do something, they can put serious money, and they're definitely going to try and undercut SpaceX. But
there are at least half a dozen companies in China right now developing reusable launch vehicles of various sizes.
Right.
So it's definitely a priority, and they sort of recognize that the era of reusable launch is upon us, and that they need to be involved in that in a big way.
Yeah. When they decide something, they get it done.
Yeah.
So interesting. Well, thank you, Eric. This is so good, man. There's so many things going on. We really should make this like a periodic thing, because there's always stuff happening in space nowadays. It's exciting. This is a great time to be a space reporter.
It's almost too much to keep track of, but it keeps me busy, so I love it.
I hope people stop blowing up stuff in space. That's not a good thing, and hopefully that will happen. We'll see. We'll definitely have to keep an eye on it.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Terry.